Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our special focus event addressing our response to COVID-19 as businesses and employers. My name is Ashley Wong. I'm an attorney here at Equinox Business Law Group. It's a pleasure to be with you today, though of course we wish it were under different circumstances. We are in an unprecedented time in history. As of this morning, we had 172 countries with confirmed cases of COVID-19, over 253,000 cases globally, and over 10,000 deaths globally, more than 200 of those in the United States. Here in Washington, we have 1,376 currently confirmed cases and 74 deaths. So this is really sobering information and staggering numbers that just continue to grow. While it can be overwhelming to try and keep up with the pace and nature of this crisis, it is our goal to be a resource to businesses and to do whatever we can to help businesses navigate this very difficult landscape. Today, our goal is to highlight some of the key issues that business owners need to be aware of, specifically how you're managing and working with your employees as we all strive to both keep our employees and the public safe, and also to keep our businesses alive and operational if possible. A few housekeeping items to start. First, this presentation is for informational and educational purposes only. This is not legal advice. We always recommend talking with an attorney about your specific circumstances before taking or refraining from any action. Second, this situation is developing and changing very rapidly. The ground is moving underneath us every day, so I will be providing the best information that I can based on what we know today. Our firm practices only in Washington, so we cannot speak to the laws of any other states, but it is important to note that every state, county, and city is working through this in real time and will be handling the situation differently. So you should consult with your local authority pages directly and often for the most up-to-date information. And finally, we are recording this presentation. It will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you do have questions, you can send them through the chat function. Given the amount of material that we have to cover today, we likely won't have time to address any questions live, but we can send out an FAQ if there are any questions that arise that would be relevant to many of our attendees. I will be referencing a number of resources throughout the program. We will provide links in the description box on our YouTube channel and on our COVID-19 resource blog post so that you can access those resources as needed. So that's our agenda, and then so let's get into it. So before we get into the immediate actions and issues, the first item that I want to do is just some general notes that are going to kind of hover over this whole presentation. So the first thing is going to be that every industry and business is affected. I know that it's really easy to just feel kind of panicked and worried about what's going on right now, but this is truly affecting the entire world. As I said, there are 172 countries that currently have documented infections, including in all 50 states. And so all businesses are seeing the impacts of this. Just yesterday, the state of California initiated a lockdown instructing citizens not to leave their homes. And in Washington, businesses are being required to shut down or severely limit their operations, which ultimately affects everyone. So everyone is being affected here. Secondly, every industry and business is unique. So everyone's going to be approaching this from a different angle with different priorities and needs. You may have already addressed some of the recommended steps here, or you may not have taken any action yet at all. And while half of employers are trying to send their employees home, the other half are trying to figure out how to keep them working. So just depending on what industry you're in, you may need to take different steps than some of your business owner counterparts. So you do need to look at your business and your specific needs and priorities when making decisions and implementing policies. Third, this situation, like I said, is developing very rapidly, so it's important to stay up to date on what is happening federally and in your locale. And then just recognize that there are a lot of unknowns still. We don't have all the answers yet. So there are updates coming every day as lawmakers try to figure out how to help businesses stay in business. And we'll try and keep you guys updated as much as possible as well. We'll be sharing blog posts and possibly doing more webinars if there's major developments. And so we're here for you to help keep you guys updated as much as we can. Fifth, contract terms will often dictate outcomes. Now, you may have employment agreements in place with your employees. You may have an employee handbook or existing policies. And as you approach dealing with your vendors and your suppliers and looking towards cutting expenses, ultimately contract terms will govern. And finally, as resources do become available, you will need to know how this crisis has impacted your business. You'll need to show that. So start documenting now while the situation is developing, because it'll be much more difficult to recreate records, if not impossible. So things are going to keep moving quickly. So do what you can to keep strong and complete records. All right, so immediate actions and issues to consider. The first step here is to assess your business. We're going to walk through sort of each of these different actions as we, the first of these being to assess your business. Every business and industry is unique, like I said, so you're going to need to consider how the virus is likely to impact your operations and the safety and health of your employees and your vendors and your business partners and customers, and what are the greatest risks that you are presented with, and we'll kind of figure out which of those risks are need to be tackled first, which fires need to be put out first, and proceed accordingly. So some of the factors that you may need to take into consideration when you're assessing your business are remote work options available? Every business has different needs. You may have some of your employees who can work remotely, some of your employees who cannot work remotely. You may already have systems in place to do that, or you may not have any as yet. So you may still need to take some action there and get creative. We have seen a lot of employers getting very creative with pivoting their operations to being online only, or to being some sort of limited operations online, just to be able to keep the wheels turning. Next is safety and hygiene measures. This is, you know, it's going to vary widely. So if you have an office space, it could be something as simple as wiping down the desks and the door handles, you know, regularly throughout the day. If you have a warehouse, it could be a much larger operation. So you're going to want to look at all of your operations and where you have close or frequent contact with the public or amongst your employees, and figure out what you need to do to put strong and safe hygiene measures in place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the presentation. Next, we have operational mandates. Like I said, some of the states and local jurisdictions are requiring that businesses limit or shut down operations. So you do want to be aware of what your requirements are there. You should also expect to see some indirect impacts, like supply chain issues of not being able to get, you know, everything that you need if you know, to make a product, or to just generally have operational issues of working with your vendors, and your vendors may also have supply chain issues. So it could have some really far-reaching downstream effects. State and local leave requirements, we will get into these as well, particularly here for the state of Washington. What employee leave benefits do you also already have in place? Do you have an employee handbook that speaks to sick leave and paid family leave, or anything of the like? Exempt versus non-exempt, you are going to want to be aware of what classification that your employees are in. Generally speaking, exempt employees are salaried, and their jobs will fall into executive, administrative, or professional categories. There have been quite a few changes in the last 12 months to our wage and hour laws, both federally and in the state of Washington. So talk with an attorney if you're not sure if your employees are exempt or non-exempt, because that will change how some of the wage and hour laws apply to your employees. Next, employment contract terms. So if you do have handbooks and policies in place, you may have existing policies, or you may have other types of contracts that apply to your employees. So if it's not just a standard employment agreement, you may have union or collective bargaining agreements, or you may have employees that you're working with through staffing agencies. So you're going to have to consider how you work with those staffing agencies and what their policies and procedures are in sending employees out to work sites. And then finally, ADA reasonable accommodation requirements. You may have some employees with existing ADA accommodations, and those may need to be updated or modified to suit our new normal. Okay, maintain safe working conditions. This is a really important one, and I'm sure that that you guys have all kind of been beaten over the head with the various safety measures that folks are starting to put in place, but this is a really important one because we are trying to, you know, get us back to business as usual as quickly as possible. So this is important to consider and put in place and really put together some robust policies and communicate those clearly to your employees. So what does that mean to maintain safe working conditions? So generally, all employers are required to maintain safe and healthy working conditions for their employees. That is true under OSHA and under state OSHA-like laws that are OSHA programs applied to the states. The general duty of OSHA requires you to furnish each worker with employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So that's just going to be a general duty, and there are some regulations, or some, not regulations, but some guidelines that OSHA has provided, which I will speak to a little bit more, that discuss specifically with respect to COVID-19 what that might look like to provide a safe and healthy workplace for your employees. Personal protective equipment. So this generally requires employers to provide employees with the PPE necessary to be able to do their job safely. One of the really challenging things that we're looking at right now is just not having enough PPE. For employers who are in the medical space or who are directly working with COVID positive or COVID suspected individuals, PPE is going to be really, really important. But the reality that we're dealing with right now is that there are just not enough masks, especially, available right now. So use the OSHA guidance and stay in touch with what they're saying with respect to using PPE. For most employers, if you're not directly working with COVID positive or COVID suspected individuals, you're not going to necessarily be required to have masks and gloves and things like that, but you may have some level that are necessary just based on the OSHA guidance. Record keeping requirements. So OSHA does generally require employers to keep records of injuries or illnesses that occur in the workplace. OSHA has spoken a little bit to whether COVID-19 is recordable, and in some circumstances, it can be a recordable illness if the worker was infected as a result of performing their work-related duties. There is a 3-part test, so you are going to want to take a look at that if you do have a case of an employee getting sick at work where it was sort of directly related to the work that they were doing. And finally, you cannot retaliate against your employees for raising concerns about safety and health conditions. I think this is probably a pretty big one right now, where we want to make sure that we're not discriminating or retaliating against our employees for raising health concerns. And we want to just maintain some flexibility here to take those concerns seriously and recognize that just everyone's under a lot of pressure right now and that employees might be feeling a lot of stress. So doing our best to put in place systems and processes that make everybody feel comfortable coming to work as much as possible. So some common business considerations for how to maintain a safe working environment: implement work from home where possible. The fewer people that you have around each other, the better. You can advise or even require your employees to stay home when they're sick, particularly when their symptoms are common symptoms for COVID-19, like respiratory symptoms and fever. Educate your employees on hand washing and require hand washing, especially if they're having to touch things that the public is touching or that a lot of other employees will be touching. Encourage social distancing, make sure that they understand that there is a 6-foot distance that we want to keep from other people, and any other hygiene or safety best practices just based on the nature of your business. Implement a disinfecting regimen. So make sure that you have folks who are disinfecting all frequently touched surfaces, so tables, doorknobs, the sink handles, all of those sorts of things. You know, if there's a water jug that everyone's using, start thinking through what are people touching and how can we make sure that those stay safe and clean throughout the day. Cancel and limit travel and events. These may be state mandates or they may just be wise choices. So take a look at what is required and then just generally what is wise. Inform employees of known exposures, but do not reveal the identities or medical information of infected individuals. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but employees do have privacy rights, and so we don't want to violate HIPAA by revealing any of their personal medical information. So if you do have a known exposure at work, or if you know that an employee has tested positive and then come to work, it is important that you, at least all of the CDC guidance is to identify anyone who had close contact with those folks and to notify them so that they can either quarantine themselves or monitor for their own symptoms and just be aware of the possible exposure. And then finally, shut down in-person operations if it's required or if it's advisable. So I have provided a few links to the OSHA standards here. Like I said, all of our links will be available on our resource blog post and on the YouTube description box. All right, there are some guidance that are specific to COVID-19 right now. So here in Seattle area, King, Snohomish, and Pierce County, the CDC has implemented a 30-day mitigation strategy, which encourages telework and expanding and just being very flexible with sick leave. It encourages social distancing, of course, and restricts any non-essential travel or large work gatherings, and it allows employers to make regular health checks of their employees on arrival if they do have to come into the workplace and can't work remotely. Seattle and King County has also issued guidelines for exposure scenarios, specific exposure scenarios. Those include confirmed or suspected COVID-19 cases, potentially exposed employees, and employees who are experiencing symptoms but don't know where that exposure came from or had no known exposures. So we will link to that as well. But you can go to kingcounty.gov/COVID for those and how they might apply to your workplace. And then finally, the OSHA guidelines, which speak specifically to preparing workplaces for COVID-19. Now, OSHA's guidelines do separate the types of workers into 4 categories, from low risk to very high risk. The very high risk is going to be those healthcare workers who are performing certain procedures, especially aerosol generating procedures, or collecting and handling specimens with known or suspected COVID-19 patients. So we're thinking nurses and other sort of directly related medical staff, emergency responders. And then they kind of go down from there all the way to low risk, where workers' jobs do not require contact with folks who are known or suspected to have COVID-19 or don't require close contact with the general public. So those folks are going to be low risk, and the steps that you take to maintain a safe working environment are going to depend on where your workers fall in those 4 categories. And OSHA has provided guidance there on their PDF, so that will be linked at the end of the presentation. Okay, so next we're going to talk about anticipating worst case scenarios. We just want to recognize the reality that we're all dealing with right now, and instead of sticking our heads in the sand, we're going to prepare for it. How are we going to do that? We are going to prepare for employee shortages first. We recognize that a lot of employees are not coming to work, whether because they are sick or because they have to care for a family member or their kids' schools are closed. So we are going to prepare for employee shortages. Just some recommendations to consider for how to do that. You may need to implement skeleton crews or work in smaller shifts or multiple shifts. You may be able to cross-train your employees. For instance, if you typically have a retail operation and you have online ordering available, your in-person customer service team may be able to be trained to do customer support over the phone, or you may have increased demand for online orders, so that may make sense for you. You may need to hire contractors or temporary employees. There are some industries that are experiencing surges. I know employment security is hiring like crazy. If you're in the cybersecurity industry or the online education industry, or something where it has to do with optimizing home office, you may have an increase in demand for employees and need for more employees. So you may need to look at other hiring options to get people up and running quickly. Make a plan for handling sick employees and employees who test positive. So we should always expect at this point that an employee may come to work sick. It may be COVID-19 or it may not be, but we are being overly cautious, especially cautious here, that it's likely that you will find yourself in this situation. So make a plan for what happens. First thing will be to send the employees home if they are sick, and to quarantine them, have them follow all of the recommended quarantine timelines, so staying home for 14 days or until their symptoms have been gone for, I believe it's 72 hours now. So just depending on the nature of the risk of your work or the employee's work, kind of figuring out how long you want that quarantine to last and what your policy is going to be there. Understand your leave and benefits policies that you have in place at your organization, as well as any laws that apply to you. So your leave and benefits policies may be more generous than what's required, and what you've got in your employee handbooks or in your employment agreements will govern there. You will want to talk to your insurance provider. What we're hearing a lot of is that most policies are not going to cover because they have virus exclusions, and so you know, a lot of us are probably going to be out of luck there. But at least give your insurance broker a call and just talk to them just to see what coverage options that you might have, and then seek any available resources and start applying now. So we will provide a list of those, for instance, SBA disaster loans, and if you can get those applications in quickly, all the better, because there's going to be a long queue for those resources. And then I said before, but document the impacts that you're seeing to your businesses and to your employees. Communicate policies to your employees and to your clients and the public if it makes sense for your business to do that. So I think that one of the biggest struggles that we're all experiencing now is employees who are probably flooding you with questions and just wondering, you know, kind of what's happening, what's going on, how are we going to deal with all of these different challenges. So I think the best thing that we can do is to put policies in place and to set standards and expectations. This can really be a great calming mechanism to help people, you know, have those expectations for what comes next, what happens if. So being prepared for what might happen and having a plan for tackling it and making can make all the difference and really help to alleviate some of the questions that you guys are surely getting. Do what you can now to have some idea of what is foreseeable and create a plan for how to respond if and when an event occurs. So some of the items that you might want to address here are remote work policies. So when you're creating a remote work policy, some of the things that you might want to consider are, is remote work required for some of your employees, or is it merely encouraged? Is remote work available to everyone or only to certain employees? For non-exempt employees, they will need to have some sort of time tracking mechanism and some way to track meal and rest breaks. You may have some requirements or guidelines for staying engaged with your team and keeping connected on video conferencing. So, you know, for us at Equinox, we have a daily huddle that we do using Microsoft Teams every day, and we, you know, do regular video conferencing and daily check-ins. So we are doing our best to keep connected as best we can. What equipment are you going to provide as a company? So if your employees do need a company laptop or phone, you know, if they need to use a VPN, what kind of things are you as an employer going to be able to provide? And if you do have the employees bringing their own devices, using their own personal laptops, you may want to have a bring your own device policy. Reasonable accommodations for disability. So I did mention this before, but if you do have employees who have existing accommodations, you may need to make some updates to those or recreate them at home. So if your employee has a standing desk in the office, you may need to figure out some way to have a standing desk or a Vera desk or some other solution at home, you know, if they request it. And then meeting with third parties. If you do have employees who need to meet with third parties, are those, or who typically meet with third parties, like meet with customers or vendors, what does that look like now? Is that going to stop entirely, or are you going to have some other mechanism for making that happen? So just maybe a question that you guys are getting. And then as a general rule, be flexible and understanding. We are all bringing our real selves to work these days. We have pets and children who are joining on our video conferences, so work may not be as seamless as it usually is, but that's just another piece that you may just want to communicate to your employees, is just some flexibility and understanding around what it means to work from home. You may also have changes to work hours and other social distancing strategies that make sense for your business, just based on the types of operations that you have. So other policies that you may need to distribute. So you might want to remind your employees of what leave and benefit options that they do have. We will also be going through some of the leave options that are available under the new Families First Act that was just passed a couple of days ago. And so those are requirements, and there are notification requirements related to those. Hygiene and safety requirements, again, reference the OSHA guidelines, consider what actions that you may need to mitigate any potential exposures. Employee travel, if you do still have employees traveling, of course, all non-essential travel should be limited and canceled in accordance with OSHA and CDC and World Health Organization guidelines. But if you do still have employees traveling, whether for personal or work reasons, establish policies and provide guidance for those employees on how to protect themselves while they're traveling. You will also want to address any quarantine policies that you have upon returning from travel, which may depend on where they're traveling to. But if you are going to require them to, say, work from home or self-quarantine, not come to work for a couple of weeks after they travel, you'll want to communicate that. Anti-harassment and anti-discrimination. We'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment, but as a general matter, make it clear that it won't be tolerated among your workforce. There should be no reason to be discriminating against any other employees, and make it clear that I think we all kind of understand now that no one demographic is more likely or less likely than any other to be carrying the virus. So we want to make sure that employees are respecting other employees. Vendor and customer relations. So how are we going to deal with our vendors and our customers? You may have employees who are regularly corresponding with customers or with vendors or service providers. So how should those employees respond to questions and concerns? How will you approach supply shortages or canceled or delayed contracts? So we're all under immense stress, so just a little bit of guidance there would probably be appreciated from your employees. And then finally, train your management on any new policies and procedures, leave and benefit requirements, and HIPAA requirements, so that you're not only aware, but also your management is aware of what those policies look like. Don't discriminate or violate privacy rights. So I touched on this a little bit, but I'll get into it here in more detail. So first, we've got the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination based on disabilities. So it requires that employers make reasonable accommodations for employees and applicants that will allow them to perform the essential functions of their job unless it would cause them an undue hardship to do so. The EEOC, which is the body that enforces the ADA with employers, has provided some guidance, and there are some kind of different rules specifically with respect to COVID-19. So what you can do here, you can ask your employees if they are experiencing symptoms or about travel exposure. You can delay start dates or require employees to stay home. You can require a doctor's note before an employee can come to work, especially if they have exhibited symptoms at work. Recognize, though, that doctors are very busy, so we want to be careful about overloading our healthcare system. So you may need to be flexible there with the doctor's note and maybe just accept an email from their clinic or some other kind of confirmation that they are okay to come back to work. You can screen applicants for symptoms after making a conditional job offer, and you can withdraw a job offer if the employee has symptoms or tests positive. You do want to be very careful to apply these policies consistently across all demographics. So you don't want to treat any one demographic of employee differently than any other. So if you do start requiring doctor's notes or screening applicants, then you are going to want to do so with everybody. What you must do, you must continue to provide reasonable accommodation through the same interactive process that we go through when employees request accommodations. There are laws that generally prohibit discrimination as well. I just want to touch on those really briefly. Employers are generally prohibited from discriminating or making employment decisions based on employees belonging to a protected class, which includes age, race, national origin, gender, and pregnancy. So if your employee is in a vulnerable population, for instance, then you are prohibited from discriminating against them. You cannot fire your employees who are elderly or pregnant purely just based on those factors alone. And no demographic, again, is more likely than any other to be carrying the virus. You cannot discriminate against your employees for exercising their rights. So if an employee makes a complaint that they don't believe that that the workplace is being maintained in accordance with OSHA, that they are not in a safe and healthy work environment, then you can't fire them for making that complaint. You can't fire them for taking sick leave. and you can't really make any sort of negative employment decisions based on employees taking sick leave or using the other rights that are afforded to them, including the rights that are afforded to them under the new Families First Act. And then finally, HIPAA. So we all have probably heard stories or had experiences ourselves of employees who have tested positive or who've been exposed to COVID-19. The CDC guidance is to notify employees of exposure, but do not reveal any identifying medical information because we don't want to have a HIPAA violation on our hands. And then finally, stay informed as the situation continues to develop. The CDC guidelines, OSHA guidelines, State Governor's Office, ESD, LNI, Department of Health, and the federal legislation that's coming down the pike right now and is still in the process of being implemented, and then any local, county, and city rulemaking. These are all places that you're going to want to continue to reference as the situation continues. All right, employee leave. So we have first sick leave. So Washington State has required paid sick leave 1 hour for every 40 hours worked. Seattle Sick and Safe and Tacoma paid sick leave. So there's other local sick leave laws. So you do have sick leave benefits that are available to your employees. You may also have sick leave policies in your handbooks. So you'll want to be aware of what sick leave is available to your employees and be flexible in allowing your employees to use that sick leave. Vacation and PTO. So again, you're encouraged to be flexible with your vacation time. If, for instance, you typically require 30 days notice to use vacation time, we don't want people feeling pressured to come to work sick if they've run out of their sick leave, for instance. So be flexible. PTO is a bucket. If you have your sick and your vacation time in one bucket, then it can be used for sick time as well. Again, refer to your policies there. Paid family and medical leave. Here in Washington, we do have a new benefit just this year of Washington State paid family and medical leave. This is partial wage replacement available for serious health conditions of employees and family members. In Washington, at least, this is not the case for the new law does address school closures, but in Washington, regular paid family medical leave is not available for school closures. They are in a significant backlog right now. They had way more applications at the beginning of the year than they were expecting to have, and I have heard that we're looking at least 10 weeks or maybe more. So employees will potentially be waiting quite a while to get compensation there for paid family and medical leave. Federal FMLA. So if you are covered under the FMLA, if you are an employer that has at least 50 employees within a 75-mile radius, then you are covered under FMLA. So that is a right that your employees have. The new act does expand FMLA. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides later. And then ADA reasonable accommodations, your employee may need to have, for instance, a flexible work schedule or some other kind of accommodation related to leave. So whether it's intermittent leave to be able to go to a doctor's appointment or something like that, those might be some accommodations that you might need to make. Leaves of absence. So this is where it's the employee who is initiating taking a longer leave of absence that would be unpaid. You may address this in your employee handbook or you may not, but it's not the same as a layoff or a furlough, but it is just one option that you have if employees have run out of all of their leave and don't want to come to work because they are afraid to expose themselves to the virus or for some reason don't otherwise qualify for leave. And then finally, workers' compensation. So I just want to touch on this because we're getting this question a lot. In most cases, exposure or contraction of COVID-19 is not considered to be an allowable work-related condition, and the employee will not be entitled to workers' compensation for that. And LNI actually does have some updates on its website in this respect. In most cases, this is just not going to be considered something that could have been contracted necessarily at work. I mean, it would be almost impossible probably to show that it was contracted at work. So unless the employee works in a position where they are more likely to be exposed at work than in anywhere else in public, then this is likely not going to be a workers' comp claim. And even if they are in those positions, you do still have to have some documented or probable work-related exposure. So benefits, You likely offer some level of benefits to your employees, whether health insurance, short-term disability, retirement, 401k plans. So talk to your broker, talk to your carriers about your coverage and your plan terms, especially with respect to workforce reduction. If you are looking at having to do layoffs, there is likely active hour eligibility requirements for your health insurance. This will vary by your carrier and by your plan. So take that into account before you start implementing any furloughs or layoffs. There is a special exchange enrollment window here in Washington that runs through April 8th at the moment. So if your employees are no longer eligible for healthcare, then that may be an option. And then you may need to provide COBRA notifications in the event that you do have to terminate employees. So just be aware of that. Okay, so a few FAQs here. Can I send employees home if they exhibit symptoms? Yes, you may even be required to do that in order to comply with OSHA's requirement to maintain a safe and healthy working environment. Again, treat all your employees equally across demographics here when you're sending them home. Don't just send home certain employees. If employees are exhibiting symptoms, send them home regardless of what demographics they fall into. 2, can employees refuse to come to work for fear of contracting COVID-19? The answer is they can, but that isn't necessarily without consequence. So if your employees have leave available, they can use it. If they do not have leave available, if they've run through all of their leave, then you can require them to come to work if they, especially if they are not sick and they're just afraid to come to work, then you can terminate them or subject them to disciplinary action. And so that's an option. Just a quick note on paying employees. If your employees are exempt, you do have to pay them if they work any part of the work week. If they are non-exempt, you only have to pay for hours that they have worked. So keep in mind what classification that they are. And then again, we're just encouraging flexibility with leave. So if an employee, if you want to keep your employees, you can allow them to take an unpaid leave of absence as well. 3, if an employee gets sick or contracts the virus at work, am I liable? Again, most likely not. L&I has been pretty clear about that. So you can check their website if you have more specific questions about a specific situation or a specific employee. What do I do if an employee tests positive? So follow the CDC recommendations. There is sort of a difference here between direct exposure and indirect exposure. So direct exposure, let's say you have an employee who has tested positive and has been at work, and you know that they've been in close contact with other employees. You do want to notify those employees that they've been in contact with. The CDC guidelines don't really speak directly to, specifically to indirect exposure. So this is a bit fuzzier. So how far down the line do you go? So, so-and-so's brother, was exposed by his coworker, and then your employee was around their brother. That, is that an exposure, and do you really need to notify in those cases? So case by case basis, just based on the risk involved and the severity of the possibility of that potentially exposed person coming to work. But as we understanding is, as it kind of goes down the line, it gets less and less likely that folks would have contracted the virus as it gets more and more indirect. Document to verify the illness per your law or per your state's laws or your company policies. Documentation for fitness to return to work. So again, be careful with how much you're requiring employees to go to the doctor, but if they do need a fitness for duty verification, then you'll want to make sure you get that. You may want to consider short-term and long-term disability if you have that available to your employees, as well as any other leave. Contact your local health authorities if it is a direct exposure, especially if it involves or could impact the public. And then again, workers' comp is available only for healthcare and first responders. Can I require a doctor's note before letting an employee come back to work? Yes, but again, be flexible here. I mentioned that a couple of times. And then, can I require vulnerable employees to stay home? Now, we did touch on discrimination a bit earlier, but we've seen this knee-jerk reaction to say, you know, I'm keeping my employees safe by sending them home. But no, you cannot do that. If you have vulnerable employees, you can encourage them to stay home and you can incentivize them to stay home, but you cannot require them to stay home. So we want to keep in mind not to discriminate, and also to accommodate ADA requests as they come up. Okay, next we're going to get into the new Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So this is a brand new law that was just signed into law on March 18th. Assuming that they go with the 15 days and don't kind of implement it earlier, then April 2nd will be the date that it goes into effect, and it'll run through the end of this year, 2020. It applies to private sector businesses with less than 500 employees. And it applies only to what we're referring to as COVID-19 qualifying events. So it has to be events that are sort of directly or potentially indirectly related to COVID-19 exposure. In the big picture, we have a couple of different pieces to the law. The first is emergency paid sick leave and public health emergency leave that employers are now required to provide to their employees, as well as an FMLA expansion that it provides for paid family medical leave for employees under a specific circumstance. It also provides for unemployment insurance relief to the states and a quarterly tax credit to help employers pay for the mandated leave. A lot of this is still unknown, and I will kind of touch on some of the things that we're waiting to hear from the DOL and the IRS on. So paid sick leave, the benefit is 2 weeks, 80 hours of paid sick leave. For part-time employees, that'll be prorated based on how many hours they typically work in a 2-week period. The pay will be at their regular rate of pay if they are caring for themselves, and at 2/3 rate of pay if they are caring for a family member or caring for a child whose school has been closed. So it's available if the employee is unable to work or telework because they have been subjected to a quarantine or an isolation order or advised by their healthcare provider to self-quarantine. It is available if they are experiencing symptoms or seeking a medical diagnosis or treatment, and it is available if they are caring for a family member who has been subject to quarantine or school closure. It is available for use on the first day of employment upon this becoming active, and the employee is entitled to use it before any other available leave. You cannot require that they use up their other leave before using this paid sick leave. There is no carryover, and you're not required to pay it out upon termination. And you're not required to carry it over into the year of 2021 either. So you also do have some notice requirements. The DOL will provide probably a poster or some other way to notify your employees. There are some exemptions, but we still are kind of waiting to see what those are going to look like. So employers who have fewer than 50 employees may be eligible for a financial hardship exemption. We're kind of waiting for the DOL to issue regulations with more information on that. The paid family and medical leave benefit is 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave. The first 2 weeks are not paid because the sick leave should cover that. You may have an exception here for employers with less than 25 employees under certain circumstances. Eligibility, so the employee has to have been employed for a period of 30 days before exercising paid family medical leave, and the rate is at 2/3 their regular rate of pay, capped at $10,000 total or $200 a day. It applies only, it's a pretty limited application here. It only applies to when you're caring for a child under the age of 18 due to their school closure, if their school was closed for reasons related to COVID-19. And again, your employee may choose to run other paid leave concurrently, but you cannot require them to run their other leave concurrently. Again, there's no carryover or payout similar to the sick leave, and notice will be required. The DOL will provide it, and there are some exemptions, but again, we're still waiting to hear on those, what that's going to look like and how to exercise it. So here's what we don't know. We don't know how exactly employees are counted, if it's on an EIN by EIN basis, or if you're part of a controlled group of businesses with subsidiaries, if they will all be considered sort of one entity with respect to whether you're under 500 or not. How will the payroll deduction or tax credit work? Again, we are just kind of waiting for the implementation rules on that. How does the employer exercise the under 50 exemption for financial hardship? These are all just things that we're kind of waiting to hear from. So as difficult as it may be, we have to kind of be a little bit patient here. And we should expect to see some additional changes that may amend these rules. And I know that Congress is also working on an additional bill for a large stimulus package. So that may provide some relief here to these additional benefit requirements that employers are looking at. Another big question is, how do businesses track what qualifies as a tax credit? Because we do have sort of specific circumstances here that it applies to with just COVID-19 qualifying events. So how do we track those things versus other qualifying events? And then what triggers the new paid leave? Do you need a recommendation from your healthcare provider, or is voluntary self-quarantine going to be enough? So those are all questions that we will keep advised on as soon as we have the answers. Workforce reduction. So we are recognizing that it is a reality that many employers are having to lay off or furlough or otherwise reduce their workforce in certain ways. So there are options available here. The ESD has really helpful information on their website. One of those options is standby. When you plan to rehire your laid off employees, you may request to place them on standby, I believe for a period of up to 8 weeks, and your employees don't have to go through all of the regular unemployment requirements to be looking for work and submitting applications that they have been looking for work. They don't need to be worrying about being available to work if you need them, and they do need, the only requirement really is that they need to keep in contact with their employer as much as is reasonable for the circumstances. When a worker is on standby, unemployment will provide partial wage replacement. And this really just provides you with a better chance of keeping your employees because you don't fully have to lay them off. So once all of this is over, assuming that everyone, for those employers who are still in business, then you should be able to bring your employees back to work. Next is a shared work program. So this is a program that ESD offers that allows employers to reduce their hours, the hours of their employees, of their full-time employees, by 10 to 50% while their workers collect partial unemployment benefits. You do have to apply for this as an employer. So you do have to go on and apply for the program, but it's not a layoff, it's just a reduction in hours. And again, your employees don't have to be looking for work or going through all the regular unemployment processes that they would have to go through if they were just laid off. The other thing that I was heard when I was in a webinar yesterday where some folks from ESD were on the phone is that the employees can also access training when they're on shared work. So when they're not working, they can actually be using that time to enhance their skills and come back to work with additional skills, which is a great option. Again, you also have the ability to do partial employment or just a reduction in hours. Businesses who need to keep operating on a less than full-time basis can request a status for their employees as partial, and again, their work search while they're on unemployment is waived. There are some requirements there, so you can go to the ESD website to look at all the options and figure out what makes the most sense for you. And then finally, layoffs and unemployment. So if you do have to look at doing layoffs and terminating your employees, don't forget about your vacation and PTO policies. Just something to consider when you're weighing the costs here is that your vacation or PTO may be considered earned wages that have to be paid out to employees upon termination. So you'll just want to weigh those costs before you make any action. Okay, so employer liability here. So we just want to address any speed bumps that might trip you up if you're not careful. We've touched on a few of these already. OSHA, if you fail to comply with OSHA or your state equivalent and fail to provide a safe and healthy working environment, then that can result in employer liability. There is something called the WARN Act, where if you are an employer over a certain size, over 100, and you're laying off at least 1/3 of your workforce, then you may have some requirements under WARN to provide 60 days advance notice of a mass layoff. How that is going to apply here and whether your state is going to waive some of those requirements is still kind of, I think, being worked out, so keep an eye on that. Discrimination and privacy violations, we touched on that, so be careful with ADA reasonable accommodations, HIPAA privacy violations, and not to take any negative action against your employees or retaliation if they choose to exercise their rights under any of their leave that's available. And then benefit charges. So again, I was on this other webinar with ESD on the line yesterday, and they spoke a little bit to unemployment benefit charges. So as of now, employers will still be charged, the unemployment will still be charged to employers' unemployment tax account. So if possible, they did recommend avoiding layoffs, but there will be some benefit charge relief, and they're kind of working through that right now. So so the idea is that the COVID-19 unemployment, won't hopefully will not be calculated, included in the calculation for your unemployment benefit charges. So just keep an eye with ESD there, and you can, I'm sure, call them with any questions, although I'm sure that the queue to get in line for calling them is probably long right now. And then we touched on workers' comp, which is limited, likely not available unless the employees are in healthcare or first responder positions. Okay, so off of employment, but kind of still tangential to employment are some business matters. So contracts. So if you are reducing your workforce, or you have quarantined employees, or you just don't have people to do work, you may need to deal with some contract obligations. So some of the things that you're going to want to look at in your contracts, again, your contract terms are going to govern here. So how long is your contract for? When does it expire? What are the payment terms looking like? Look at your termination and expiration. So what are your options here? Do you have the ability to terminate for convenience if you're looking to cut costs? Is one party going to have to breach the contract because they just don't have revenue coming in, or because they're unable to perform any of their non-payment obligations? And then what does termination mean? What is the effect of that termination happening? If you do have auto renewals, I would say be careful of those. If you don't intend to auto renew, for instance, one of your software services, then you will want to make sure that you catch the auto renewal before it comes up, and deliver any notices of termination if you need to. And then force majeure. So this is a big topic right now. When something like this happens and it feels like an act of God or something that's totally out of your control, does force majeure apply? So your contract language is going to govern here. You're going to want to take a look at the actual language that's in your contract. So you may have some language related to virus or some other kind of impossibility to perform. So just take a look at what that language looks like, and you can have an attorney look at that for you and make a judgment, but there may be some interpretation to be done there. I will note that force majeure often does not include excuse for non-payment. It often is just non-payment related obligations, so actual performance related obligations, but you'd have to look at the language to know, and notice is typically required if you do want to exercise force majeure. Keep in mind that you can also always make a mutual agreement. I know that a lot of businesses are struggling right now, and we're all in this together. We're all trying to get through this together. So when you have valued business relationships, you don't always have to go directly to dispute resolution. You guys can agree to delay a project or cancel a project, just documented in writing. And then failing all of that, you may have to resort to your dispute resolution provisions in your contract. Insurance. So talk to your broker about insurance coverage and any exclusions that might apply. So again, we're seeing a lot of virus exclusions, so insurance may not be an option, but it's worth a conversation with your broker. And then finally, business resources. So here is a list of a whole bunch of resources that are available to you. So there are SBA economic injury disaster loans. We do encourage you to go on there and apply. Again, document as much as you can. We're also seeing the Department of Revenue has provided some business tax relief, so extensions on filings, extensions on payments. Call them to talk about payment plans. They're delaying audits, they're waiving penalties. So there's a whole bunch of different relief there. And then just kind of a bunch of different options for grants, business relief funds that are available. A lot of these are going to be limited to certain locations or require application program, or some type of an application to get to it. But just take a look at each of those, and also, your utilities may be providing some relief. I know that PSE, Comcast, CenturyLink, and T-Mobile have all provided some relief on utilities where they won't shut you down for non-payment for a period of time. Be prepared to report actual impacts. We've said this a few times, but be sure that you're tracking any lost or canceled contracts, any layoffs or furloughs or other sort of workforce reductions that you're having to take, and any drops in revenue that you're seeing, especially if you're applying for disaster loan. You're going to need to show what kind of impacts you're experiencing in order to kind of demonstrate what kind of loans that you need. And we do know, again, that Congress is working on a much larger relief bill as we speak, so stay tuned. What now? Okay, so this is easier said than done, but moving forward, the first thing is don't panic. Remember that every business is asking the same questions and has all the same concerns. So as best you can, don't panic and make a plan. So that's going to look like assembling a team, bring together all your senior leadership, your major stakeholders, your managers. Also contact your critical business advisors like your attorneys and your CPAs, and get your team together so that you can tackle it together and strategically. Go through the process of assessing your business and taking actions to create policies and distribute those as needed to your employees and your vendors and your business partners and the public if necessary. Make a list, make a plan. So we can tackle this one thing at a time, put people first, generally just be clear about what your expectations are, and do your best to be flexible and understanding as we deal with this unprecedented crisis, and I'll just try to get through this together. And then finally, just embrace kindness, flexibility, and understanding. As business owners and employees, we're all feeling the pressure. Uncertainty is the only certain thing right now, so it can be really uncomfortable. But remember that business doesn't happen in a vacuum. We all come to work as whole people. Many of us are concerned for their own well-being or for the well-being of their friends and family. So the best thing that we can do is just recognize that in the way that we interact with people, and make decisions in this difficult time. So before we wrap up, I wanted to share just a little bit about Equinox for those of you who aren't familiar with us. Our clients are business owners who are seeking to not only fix issues that arise, but to avoid problems through proactive planning. They rely on Equinox to be their general counsel, a sounding board for their entire team on issues like this one, and a resource to help them implement the right solutions for their business. And we do that at a fixed price with our general counsel services program. So that provides some predictability, which I know is something we can all appreciate in a time where so much is uncertain. So we're happy to talk to you more about our general counsel services model if you are interested in learning more. And we're here for you through all of this, and we'll be here when this is all over and when things are back to business as usual. And then we have a focus event. We planned this months ago, but it seems even more relevant now, practical challenges of the modern workplace. So we're going to be looking at the workplace that is ever changing and looking different, with more challenges coming along with this new normal. So as you can see there, we're going to be looking at remote workplaces and all the kind of challenges that come with that, flexible schedules and changes to the law that can impact the workplace as well. So join us for that on April 16th. Thank you very much, and you all have a wonderful day, and give us a call if you guys need any help navigating any specific issues, or just generally keep in touch with us online on our blogs, and sign up to receive our newsletter if you do want to get legal alerts on as things continue to develop. Have a great day. Bye-bye.